I know I talked about his content on the channel before. He's one of the people alongside Wes Albert that I recommend for people looking to get better at jobs. I'm happy to be an introduction to a brand new player. I will try not to mislead you, but the moment that you start to get more advanced, you've mastered everything I can do, and you're starting to have questions about, hey, I think I can do this better, I want to improve. Desperius FFXIV is a YouTube channel with the lovely Desperius himself, who does an incredible job helping you get better at the game. He plays both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy. A huge reason that he plays World of Warcraft is because he uses it to augment the PvP experience and the top-end experience that he wants, that Final Fantasy just does not do as well of a job serving for him. And he's awesome. What he's going to be talking about today is macros to use and macros to not. And so when we talk about MMOs, especially MMOs that obviously have to pay very close attention to latency, they add things such as global cooldowns and so on to help kind of overcome that. And so when you start to talk about phrases like spell queuing, macros become something that can really hurt you. And if you don't know why, it's really easy to lean into them as a set of training wheels, and that seems like a huge advantage, but they can have disadvantages as well. So I look forward to his thoughts on that as we dive in.
Which I want to talk briefly about macros and if they're considered useful in Final Fantasy XIV or should be avoided. Unfortunately, the short answer is it depends. So let us hop in and talk about the circumstances. First of all, we have to cover the categories, starting with macros that are being used for all sorts of gameplay, with battle or active skill macros performing a /skill name command that you can use to put together a whole sequence of active skills that then will be activated automatically. Even if these may not be bringing the total ruin to your performance, don't use these with any battle job, except you want to grind down open world content being AFK or not participate in anything with other players. The reason for this is kinda simple. The natural global cooldown or time between one and the other weapon skill or spell demands your character and your battle set of skills to wait for basically 2.5 seconds, which is also affected by skill or spell speed. The macro on the other hand will either be too fast when simply lining up skills without a certain wait, or when using this wait command you cannot use these fractional numbers, which means with any global cooldown timing not anywhere close to the 2-second mark, you may be punished and lose uptime for your spells.
That seems like it wouldn't add up. It seems like not that big of a deal. You're like, well, I'm not doing it optimal anyway. What I will tell you is that encounters in this game range from single-digit minutes well into the 10 or 15 minute mark. And so if you are talking about something where every minute you are losing one or two abilities, or you talk about times when you are trying to get a certain number of abilities inside of a buff, that buff window gives you a 20 or 25 second sprint to try to do as much damage in that window as possible, losing a single ability cast in there adds up massively. And so when you talk about kind of rounding errors there, that's a problem. When you talk about the fact that, like, as the server pings, if it forgets one of these, if something about the way you spamming it doesn't allow it to queue and so it misses one, there are massive losses here. Massive losses. And that's before we talk about how this is affected when you get into latency specifically.
This may not be a big deal for a short period of time, but it definitely is when using this consistently. So when you're not doing something totally pointless with no relevance to your performance that may negatively affect other players, and even if you may struggle with your job's rotation, hit spells individually in fighting content. Believe me, the muscle memory will come, and after a while you will actually not miss the lack of macros compared to other MMOs.
That's actually one of the problems I have with macros. If macros were something that a new player said, hey, I've never tanked before, Gunbreaker is my favorite one, I want to put the Gnashing Fang combo on a macro just till I get comfortable, I would understand that, especially in casual content, normal content. I would understand that as a way of condensing down the number of buttons you need to push in a rotation so you can focus on things like being positioned in the right place, doing the things that your job does outside of the abilities that it's using more situational abilities such as defensive buffs. I get that. That makes sense as a way of reducing that down as a form of training wheels. The problem is that once you get settled into that, what are the odds that you're really going to take those training wheels off? What are the odds is that as you build to become a better player, as you build to move into harder content, especially if you desire to get into Extreme, Savage, or Ultimate, that you're able to slowly pull items out of that and say, you know what, this macro used to handle these 4 abilities. Now it handles these 3 abilities. Now it handles these 2 abilities. And so if there was a way to easily pull back, I would actually understand them as a way of learning a job, especially for the jobs that start at higher levels, such as Gunbreaker. But instead, I would just encourage you to go run lower content with them. I would encourage you to back them down to like level 17 or 20. I don't think once you know the job that content feels very good on jobs that start at a higher level than the content. I think Gunbreaker feels particularly poor among the tanks when you get into level 20 or 25 type content. When you sink down, I think it feels awful. It was not designed for that. But that's once I'm comfortable, it's actually a really great way to learn the job and then add that stuff in the order that Square Enix thought you should, not in the way you pull them out of a macro.
Yet, on this active skill command section, there's another department of the game where these are a game changer nonetheless, namely when looking at crafting macros. As time is not the defining factor here, hitting up your GCD with not a single millisecond loss is not necessary. You can easily put together a whole sequence for crafting a certain piece of gear. The difference between 2 or 3 seconds to wait after the previous action is not troublesome here.
Yeah, and so this is really going to matter. When you're talking about gil per hour and you're willing to actively play and instead you're sitting there and staring intently at your macro, it is less optimal. But like crafting macros, there are websites that build them for you. I've had a lot of fun building my own. And when people have looked at my macros, they've been more than willing to point out the fact that they're not optimal. And I know that. I built them. I haven't double checked them against the best ones. But once you have a macro that has a 100% chance at getting maximum quality and completing the craft, because crafting in this game is about filling this bar before this amount of life runs out, your durability, and then as a secondary objective, filling the quality bar and the progress bar before you run out of durability while using your mana and using abilities. As long as it is achieving maximum quality, maximum progress before durability runs out every single time, the only thing that can be more optimal is doing it in less time. And if you don't care about that, then it's good enough and you're not hurting anybody else. You're wasting your own time and that's your prerogative.
As it does not matter much completing a craft in 50 or 55 seconds, especially when you're able to make the strategic thought process of crafting rotations become obsolete with these macros, that some may like while others don't. However, it is useful in the crafting sector, and if you're lazy to craft thousands of weapons manually or just want a comfortable straight up macro without any failure potential, using /skill command macros here is just super enjoyable. Coming to the next category, which is target macros. Basically all of these are useful as they can help you.
I use this one specifically for Dark Knight. Target macros are a little bit different because the function here is to change the default target so that you do not have to have something selected for it to be the objective. And so something like Salted Earth, which is a thing that when you cast it, it asks you to place it. What this macro does is it says, you know what, just go ahead and place it on my target. Don't place it on me. It's also how for healers you activate mouse over, is you would do something like this.
Out with target management a lot, especially when looking at party buffs that require a certain target like the Dragoon's Dragon Sight for example, which I love to bind onto a focus target instead of manually untapping the boss and searching for a potential target. With this macro you can easily define a party member before the fight starts by putting them into your focus target, and the macro will automatically cast Dragon Sight on your dedicated buddy, removing any necessity to lift your focus off the boss. Above that, and another very common and useful macro is the one that I use for the Dark Knight's Salted Earth, where otherwise you have to place a certain AoE marker or zone into a designated position. And holy crap, that can be truly painful and an insanely messy execution because these skills are having a weird execution delay. So to avoid running into trouble with this, you can easily just throw down Salted Earth onto yourself. And being a Dark Knight, this command will help you getting rid of or fight off this annoying execution delay.
Especially if, like me, you use your left and right as strafe, and so the way that I actually turn is with my mouse. And so throughout the encounter, I'm already using my mouse. It's already being used. And so the idea that I have to stop steering for a moment to place something down before we even talk about latency, that is the elephant in the room here, I would rather it just be placed on my target. And if there is a target within a large group that I would rather be centered, then I can change to that target for the purpose of placing this. I'm okay with that, just like I would do for targeting where an explosion would go on something like a caster. You're going to pick that center monster if they all have the same amount of life.
But there's also another alternative to use at the target location, for the case you want to throw Salted Earth into the face of your enemy directly. But in my experience this can be quite buggy for big enemy hitboxes, but try it out for yourself. Just when it comes to super accurate placement of these, I recommend to use them manually, so having access to the usual skill and the target macro can improve your tanking or healing life quality.
That's the sort of thing that I just play suboptimally. I like this fine. I find that especially anything that does not drastically impact the way I roll combos, where I'm just trying to keep this on cooldown, I find that this is something that I will cross over in macroing. Macroing is suboptimal, and the level of suboptimal it is really, in my mind, matters how much does it impact other players. If it doesn't impact other players, it's up to you whether or not to be that suboptimal. And I don't think Salted Earth specifically causes a massive effect on my ability to tank encounters to the level that I would without the macro, or I desire to. But when you start to talk about like substantially cutting down my DPS, that is something that impacts the party, and I should just get better.
Okay, next up we got boss strategy macros, which are super helpful to communicate and set certain positions for each individual player in party finder scenarios. I cannot live without these for any random group doing extreme or savage content, where everybody is easily able to catch a certain spot of the macro, stick to this spot, and the mechanics accompany, and help reduce the frequency of miscommunication and people running into wrong spots or doing the wrong mechanic for their designated letter or number. Last but not least, there are millions of macros out there that can help you in improving the quality of life of your UI and dealing with it. These collapsing hotbars, for example, are one of the best ways to reduce interface clutter and push your gameplay immersion onto another level, or simply use macros that hide away interface elements that
You can also put timers on those, and so like for a while I was using a consumable one that had a 10-second toggle. So you would press it, it would pull up the consumables, you'd click the consumable you want, and 10 seconds later it would fall off. It was a toggle, and so if you accidentally click it again to toggle it off, you have to toggle it back on and wait the 10 seconds. So that was just a nature in the way I did it. But you can absolutely decide stuff like this. I also, when I change jobs, have macros set up for changing jobs, and so that every time I change jobs, it sorts my inventory, sorts my armory, brings out a different mini pet, all of these different things that I just want to take place as I change jobs, so that continually as I'm changing jobs in content, my inventory tends to stay relatively sorted.
you don't need in fighting encounters or other situations. So check out some of my guides, especially the collapsing hotbars video, and visit the lodestone for all sorts of tips and ideas how to set up macros properly.
You can also turn off and on certain UI elements. You can toggle those. So if you want to have raid frames that are different, in World of Warcraft you would use add-ons to say that when you're engaged and you're detected to be in a raid, that certain raid frames certain things just disappear. So when you're in combat, certain things fall off, certain things come up. But macros are a great way of imitating that behavior, since we don't really have the same add-on support for this game.
Also check out Mr. Happy's or other people's videos, because macros can easily become an essential tool to your overall quality of life in Final Fantasy. And as long as you're not using them for /skill sequences in battle combat with others, you should definitely use macros in Final Fantasy XIV.
So the last thing here, since I don't think he's going to hit on it, is the fact that spell queuing exists. And what spell queuing does is basically, because we operate in a game that has latency as a factor, and because the number of abilities you cast per minute would impact the amount of DPS you put out there, they have implemented a system to allow people with worse internet connections to perform hopefully as close to as well as people with better internet connections. That's not internet speed, upload, download, like every ISP would have you feel that if you just pay for a bigger package, you're better. That's actually the amount of the time, the ping. And so it's not something you always have control over. It's going to become incredibly pronounced when people start doing cross data center, or we start playing with people in Europe or Japan, where your internet speed is bound by how fast it can travel across fiber line. It's that speed of light. It's a constant. There's nothing you can do about it. You can try to reduce the number of hops it takes by using a VPN, but it's only going to get so good. And so when you have people that have worse internet connections, it's not something you can easily and quickly change about the way you interact with this game. So they've done spell queuing. And what spell queuing allows is that if you cast an ability and it's close to when you'd be allowed to cast that ability, the server will say, let me handle that for you. And so technically the one ability has not ended, but right there at the end, I believe it's the last half a second. It's quick, it's short, it's a short little window. I used to have an overlay in World of Warcraft for my ping that told me. So on my cast bar, it actually had a little color. So when it was in that color, I knew that I was in my spell queue. And so it would allow me to, any action I take, allow that cast to finish and start the next one. This is also the basis of where things like slide casting come from, where when you're on a caster and you cast an ability and your character's still holding that staff casting and you start moving right in that last little half a second of the cast bar, it doesn't clip the cast. It allows the cast to go off. So animation wise, it looks like you're casting on the move, but that's because you have a window in there where the server says, hey, I don't know the latency of every single player, and so I've baked something in to help kind of protect. And so that's something that is baked into the way that spells perform in these games. It's incredibly important. It's something that allows your latency to not impact the amount of DPS that you do, and it's something that allows you to chain your abilities together so that from the server side of things, it's ability 1, 2, 3, not 1, and then a pause, and then 2, and then a pause, and then 3. Macros cannot do this. They don't spell queue. And so you are giving up anything that the game has baked in to help you be able to move better in encounters and help you to chain abilities together. You are giving that up freely, willingly, not because in this one moment the encounter got to be overwhelming or in this one moment it didn't matter as much. You are giving it up across the board when you choose to move into macros. And so it is incredibly important, and that means that any ability when the macro hits that gets dropped because it doesn't read the macro correctly, those abilities may just not go off. There's all sorts of things. Spell queuing is a redundancy mechanism. It helps protect. It makes sure that your ability does get queued, that it does go off, and that it goes off when you intended. Macros give all of that protection up.
So hop into the whole topic and create some of the best target, crafting or UI helper macros Eorzea has ever seen, and if you like, share them with our community in the comments section. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep loving Final Fantasy.
Well stated as always. I don't know how in 5 minutes he can do what takes me 30. But if you are looking for somebody that has that kind of mindset of optimizing as part of their content, I encourage you to go check out Desperius. He does a great job of communicating like why he thinks this way and what he thinks will make you a better gamer. Obviously, things like rotations are subject to change over expansions. Obviously, there's some debate within optimization. Technically, this community thinks that they're getting an extra 2% out of this, depending on this situation. But for the average gamer who's just trying to get better, resources like this are incredibly rare and incredibly valuable. And so it is absolutely awesome in whichever one communicates the way, whether it be Wesk Albert or Desperius or the Balanced Discord or SaltedXIV.com, which I think is changing the way that it's owned going into Endwalker. And so all of these, I really appreciate video guides. I really appreciate somebody that thinks logically, explains why they think that way. So Desperius has always been a go-to for me when I have a question about how something works, why something works a certain way, and I just want to know more about the game. I kind of wish that he was more, I wish he'd gotten into like raid guides, because I can't get enough raid guides when I look to do harder content. I want to hear it said as many ways as possible, and I've always appreciated the way he looks at it, and so I would love to see him have this level of depth explaining why we act certain way in raids and why certain mechanics go off that way. If I could have anything from Desperius, it would be more content, just more, it's his time and I'm not paying for it. So just more, just all of it. You should publish every 2 hours just because, it'd be great. It'd be really convenient for me. I don't know if I'll even watch all of it, but, I just appreciate you and everything that you think about gaming, kinda.